Welcome. Welcome back. This is another in a series of mini lectures. Today, I just want to talk a little bit about the class to come on Wednesday. Most of it will be devoted to having Tony Giga come. He is the budget director of NYU. He's been doing that for a number of years. He and I go way back. We both worked at the Office of Management Budget in New York City after the fiscal crisis, so that's our professional background together. I know him personally as well as his superior really budgeting skills. So what he'll do is I believe what he's going to do is bring a bunch of paperwork for you to look at that describes how NYU's budget works and looks. This will give you a good sense of how a large private institution organizes its finances, and then he'll also talk a lot about process, about how decisions are made, and that's, as you'll see from the reading today in chapter 7 in particular, that's very much about processes. So it'd be good to situate some of what Tony talks about relative to some of the process discussion in chapter 7. So that's mostly what we'll be doing. We'll also be doing a case study. But here today I want to be able to just go back over some of the Goldstein readings and pick out what I think the high points are, the things that I think you ought to know about, and the things you don't have to worry about so much. I want you to read all the chapters, but obviously I'm not going to be asking you to not going to be testing you on things like the pie charts, what percentage of, what's the allocation in private institutions for financial aid, those types of things. I want you to read it and understand it, but let me just talk a little bit about what I think the important things are in the chapters. Now, we've actually talked a lot about chapter 4 in the last session. That was, if you will, the big picture of budgeting. So I don't think we need to talk more about that here. But the other chapter, which we didn't talk much about last time, was the one on revenues. And then that is tied, in fact, to, in essence, to the first chapter for this week, chapter 5, which is expenses. All budgets are revenues on the one side and expenses on the other. They usually have to meet or balance on paper. You never know whether they will balance in the real world because they are done the year before the actual fiscal year happens. But typically, budgets, you want to see whether you can generate sufficient revenues to cover the projected expenses. That's the goal. And then you have to see if you can make it happen. So the revenue section, the revenue chapter, mostly where there, I want you to understand the terms and kind of get a feel for the proportions. Why, how tuition and fees, why they're so important to certain institutions. Why in other institutions they're always going to be incredibly important in all institutions in this day and age. We simply don't have a public system the way some countries do, where it's essentially funded by the government or from some other source. All public institutions now are heavily dependent, most are heavily dependent upon tuition. Certainly private institutions are heavily dependent upon tuition. So depending upon the level of endowment spending, which can help support that, we talked about endowment last time too, tuition is really important. So the other aspect of the chapter 4 that I want to draw your attention to, and we will be talking about this a lot more when we get to philanthropy, is the very, very, very important aspect of what's called restrictions to the nonprofit sector and to higher education in particular. Restrictions are, as a former CFO, I didn't like restrictions because what it means is when you get a gift, you can only spend the money the way the donor says you can spend it, and donors can restrict any way that they want. So it ties up your financial flexibility. On the other hand, that's just the flip side of the coin, that were it not for restrictions, you wouldn't have philanthropy, and philanthropy is really a huge benefit to the sector because higher education can present itself as a kind of entity that people just want to give money to without anything specific in return. What they get in return is the good feeling of having given the money, and also, nowadays in particular, getting a sense that the institution is doing what they want them to do, so that they can actually get something out of the program or the building that their money has funded. But once a restriction comes in, on the finance side, it becomes very important to track and to understand that restriction. We have not yet looked, we looked with Maddie at the second column of unrestricted and restricted when we look at financial statements. You'll recall now that when we did your college, everything was done in one column. There was no notion of for activities or from assets or whatever, that these are restricted and these not. We will get to that later, but just keep in mind that that's one of the things I did to simplify that spreadsheet greatly, was to eliminate any notion of unrestricted and restricted. In the real world, with nonprofit or higher education accounting and budgeting, restrictions become very important to be aware of. Now, Chapter 5, what I want you to recognize, is basically the same thing as Chapter 4. Understand the terms. Again, I don't want you to memorize all of the, all the percentages, like how much is scholarships and fellowships in a public higher education, what percentage of spending it is. But do go through those categories and understand, for instance, understand why instruction is always the key, the number one thing that we start out with when we talk about budgeting. We talk about instruction budgeting, but also recognize that almost always instructional costs, direct instructional costs, are far from the largest, or far from the majority of costs that are, or expenses that are recorded in a budget or projected in a budget. In fact, I think we see here that typically, both in public and private institutions, or four-year institutions, that instruction comprises about a third of the actual costs, the expenses that are projected and actually eventually spent. We then go through, so you need to understand why what public service is, what research is, what academic support is, what student services are, what institutional support is, operation and maintenance of plant, and so on. So these are all issues that, I think I will want you to be able to identify and describe what they are and why they're important. We then skip to, I think, the key, having done revenues, expenses, and basically just kind of understanding the terms that are there. The meaty chapter, I think, in this week's reading is the one in Chapter 7, Comprehensive and Special Purpose Budget Models. This is where we get to the issue of, not everybody budgets the same way. That's the case in companies, that's the case in governments, and it's certainly the case in higher education. So read the chapter and keep in mind that budgets are not only what we talked at the beginning, not only are they many things, that they are a planning tool and they're a control tool, but there are many ways to actually structure the budgeting process. Let's just go through so we understand what he's getting at when he talks about them. For instance, he starts out by saying there's such a thing as formula budgeting. What does he mean by that? Well, like a lot of particularly governmental activity that's driven by formulas, it can be that Campus X, Campus Y, Campus Z can get their budget under some sort of formulaic approach. That's usually a measure of not outputs, how well they do on a performance basis, but usually on the basis of inputs. So, and as he points out here, formula budgeting is less the case with respect to an individual campus or an individual school that will allocate funds internally via a formula. Where formulas become really important are in public systems like a CUNY or a SUNY or a Michigan State public system. There, from a top level, from the state government level, or the overall funding level, the question arises, how much does John Jay get versus Baruch? How much does the University of Michigan get versus Michigan State? Well, there are many ways that could be approached, and in fact, a number of states have experimented with performance ways of doing it. That is to say, if you do better, you get more, or we'll try to measure outputs. So far, it's very, very difficult to do that. So what you have here, just as we talked before that a program approach is at variance with an incremental approach because an incremental approach is easy. Well, a formula approach is easy. It's just so much easier for a Michigan to say, or a Wisconsin to say, or a CUNY or SUNY to say, the basic way that we allocate funds is on the basis of the number of students or the number of courses, and there's all different ways that the formula is done, but an allocation that's basically made to a campus on the basis of some sort of metrics or some sort of numbers that are kept track of. So formula budgeting is very important, but again, it's more at the system level than what an individual institution would do. Goldstein then goes on to bring back the question of incremental budgeting again. He has some bad things to say about it and some good things to say about it. I think the fact it's persistent. It kind of works. It's also very difficult to try to do something different from that just because systems are hard to change. People expect to continue to get the kind of money that they got last year. But so you will constantly see incremental budgeting in play. You will often see incremental budgeting in play. I think the ideal situation would be take a small, stable liberal arts college. Nobody wants to upset the apple cart. Nobody's saying we're going to go out of business. Nobody says we have to make vast budget cuts, and what are we doing? Take probably a Williams College or an Amherst College. I don't really know whether they engage in incremental budgeting, but I think historically a place that is stable and is kind of stable financially and relatively small so that it can be done on a top-down basis, probably incremental budgeting is still going to be something that you're going to see a lot of. But we have now, think of it this way, we now move to the next category, which he describes as responsibility center budgeting. I'll probably want to put some stuff on if we have time, on the whiteboard when we meet to show you how this works. And it's something that Tony is aware of because he works at a large place. The gist behind things like responsibility center budgeting is this: how do you handle budget decisions in a very large institution that tends to be, if you remember your organizational theory, higher education is what's called loosely coupled. It's not the type of place that can be run on a top-down basis that well. It's not run top to bottom because the bottom talks back. Individual faculties, individual schools, individual research centers have a lot of their own power, and it becomes very difficult to run a place like University of Michigan or NYU on the basis of a central budget staff telling everybody what they're going to get. And then if more money comes in, that everybody gets the same amount of money based upon, rising tide lifts all boats. What happens, and what happens if you try to do that is that it creates a series of bad incentives. That is to say, let's say you're in a growing department, biochemistry. You might be able to bring in more students and generate more revenues. Where do those revenues go? Well, under a top-down approach, pure top-down, you might decide to grow the chemistry department by 10%. And maybe that means that because you're space constrained, maybe it means you have to increase your average class size from 22 to 25. Well, why would you want to do that if you don't get any money back? I mean, if the idea behind this is you make decisions at the departmental or school level, which have financial consequences, but the central people upstairs get to decide what to do with the results of your decisions. So, for instance, you bring in more students, bring in more net revenues, but all those net revenues come in centrally, and the central decision makers may or may not decide to give you some of that money to bring your class size down. Well, you're not going to have an incentive to want to do that. So what responsibility center budgeting is a way to try to find a way to square this very difficult circle between the need for central vision and the need for central control and the fact that schools and departments almost need to be able to control their own revenues and resources, but they can't do it 100%. So if you read through responsibility center budgeting, we'll talk about it with Tony. What I want you to get here is this notion that it's a compromise. It's a bit of a compromise between the ideal of having a top-down vision, here's where we're going, if revenues go up, here's what we want to do with them, versus the need for the many departments and the many schools to control their own fates in some reasonable way. How that's done is the trick behind responsibility center budgeting, so you need to give that some thought. We then have we talked a little bit about this, I think Dwight mentioned last week, zero-based budgeting. Zero-based budgeting is another option. Read that, understand it. The basic idea is everything starts from scratch. It's the opposite of incremental budgeting. With incremental budgeting, it's assumed that everybody gets the same and maybe a little bit more. With zero-based budgeting, it's assumed nobody gets anything, and you have to defend your program from the bottom up and show every year. It's a very difficult thing to do, both for in terms of the data management, the information management aspect, as well as the human relations aspect. People don't want to feel as though they have to start from scratch every year. It tends not to work, frankly. But everybody talks about it, and it's always out there as an option. From time to time, people try it, and from time to time, they're successful. But do understand what that's all about. We now come to what we have here at the last piece, initiative-based budgeting. And I want you to understand that, if you will, as a compromise or a midway between zero-based budgeting and incremental budgeting. Think of it this way. All right, we know that zero-based budgeting doesn't work. We know that starting from scratch every year has huge operational problems, human relations problems, morale problems. So we're not going to do that. We're kind of gonna let everybody keep what they have. But we're not going to just do incremental budgeting either. We need to find some way of generating some chunk of new revenues to move us in a strategic direction. We're not going to do it 100% with zero-based budgeting from the bottom up. Neither are we just going to let the river flow like an incremental. What is initiative-based budgeting? Well, let's compromise. Let's go and tell everybody that they have to make a 2% or a 3% adjustment to their spending. So we're not asking you to redo everything down to zero and defend everything. Neither are we saying that you get to keep everything. We're going to just take a chop and sort of say, you go think really hard about what you would do to save X percent. Now that X percent, if it's operationalized and that happens, that X percent, now we're not doing it from down to zero, we're taking that flow in, we're holding it centrally. Now we can sit back and we can take the 2%, the 2%, the 2%, the 2% from all these different places, and we can say to ourselves, we now have a pot of money, and that pot of money is not unlimited, but that pot of money can now fund the new initiatives. So it's a way for central administration to, in effect, to whack at, force people to think about reallocating their own money to try to take a chunk of it back from them in the budget process in order to generate revenues in the budget process for what the central administration, what the president, what the board, what the key decision makers want to do. Because if they don't do that, what often happens is in incremental budgeting, the river just sweeps everything away, and the next thing you know, there's no money left over to do anything that represents a major initiative. So if you're going to have, again, if we're going to go back to this question of strategic planning, that the plan must drive the budget, sure, the plan should drive the budget. We should be able to say this is more important than that, but then where does the central people, the central decision makers, the CFO, the provost, the president, where do they get the money for that? Well, initiative-based budgeting is one of the solutions for that. And it's a way of kind of, if you will, compromising with the system and saying, look, we're not asking you to start from scratch with a zero-based approach, but we're not going to let you have it all either with incremental. We're going to take a chunk of it, we're going to force you to think hard about what you would do with less, we're going to take that difference and we're going to use it for strategic initiatives. And that's where we get on page 102, reallocating funds for new initiatives. The last piece that's talked about here is called performance-based budgeting on page 103. Read that as well. My only comment about that is this. Performance-based budgeting made its way it's largely been a governmental, in government there's a lot of talk about performance-based budgeting. And the idea is, to measure who does things well and then to fund success of things that are being done well. And I guess the only thing I want to say about performance-based budgeting in higher ed is this. The typical problem in higher ed has always been and will be for some time outcomes. That's why people usually measure inputs. That's why, a lot of times with budgets and everything else, people always complain we're measuring inputs, we're not measuring outcomes, we're not measuring outputs. Well, sometimes with government you can measure performance, you can measure outcomes. How many tons of garbage did the sanitation department pick up? That's a relatively clear metric, and you can build performance metrics into your budgeting process in order to create incentives for people to pick up more trash or to pick it up more effectively or efficiently. But how do you do that in higher ed? How do you compare an English department with a chemistry department with a German literature department? How do you really know what your outputs are? Outputs are what trips higher education always up, and it makes it very difficult to measure things, which isn't to say it shouldn't be done. Much of the discussion now that it's taking place in Washington and around the world is on this question of how can we measure outputs better or outcomes better. But until we do that, we haven't really figured out how to do it well, performance-based budgeting or budgeting that's built around outcomes and rewarding good outcomes is always going to take a back seat, in my view, at least within higher education. And then there's a question on character and culture at the end of pages 106 through 111, which I think is worth paying attention to as well. So those are those are the issues that I see coming up this week. Oh, actually, I see no, we don't. No, those are our chapters, and I think I think I'm about done in terms of what I need to say today. So, thank you, and see you on Wednesday.